All right, the clock is showing 1:02 here in Lexington, Massachusetts, and we are going to start today's webinar. This is Scott Anthony, Innosight's managing partner, co-author of the Harvard Business Review article, Build an Innovation Engine in 90 Days. I'm joined today by one of the other co-authors of the article, David Duncan. Good afternoon, Dave.
Hello, everyone.
And we are excited to go through some of the key concepts that we describe in the article. We are very much intending for today's webinar to be as interactive as possible. We welcome your questions. We will pause a couple of times to answer some of the questions that have come in. Please feel free to submit your questions. We'll try and take the best of the questions and answer them. If we can't get to all of the questions, we'll try to summarize some of the answers after the webinar. We also have a poll that we're going to run midway through the webinar to, again, try to make this as interactive as it can possibly be. Just to give a little bit of context for those of you who might not know Innosight, we are 80 colleagues around the world that are united in a mission of helping our clients see what's next and be what's next in the face of all of the disruptions that are shaking the face of the global economy today. We were co-founded by famous Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen, who many of you know, and we help our clients really answer three critical questions. How do I ensure my organization continues to achieve its goals, creating growth strategies that set our future direction in the face of market turbulence? How do I build the capabilities required to stick to that strategic path? And how do I spot, seize, and scale opportunities to create new growth businesses? The specific topic we're going to focus on today is really primarily in that second category there, about how I build the capabilities and capacity to begin to make innovation more of a repeatable and sustainable discipline. This is something that everyone will agree is a problem worth working on. The figures here are from 3 different surveys around innovation. 93% of executives say that their long-term success requires the ability to innovate. I haven't found the 7% who disagree with this statement. We all know it's critical for long-term success. Many companies believe they've got to do something really important and difficult over the next few years. Not just incrementally innovate, but fundamentally transform their business. 75% of senior executives in a recent survey said innovation is a top 3 priority for their firms. I think no news to those who have joined us on the webinar today. This is an absolutely critical issue. And probably no news for people on the webinar either that this is a real challenge for people. Only about 1 in 5 executives believe that their strategy is delivering competitive advantage. Only 1 in 3 executives are confident they will be able to master transformative change. Even those that appear to have it right will self-admit that this is a challenge for them. In a recent poll, 40% of companies that are identified by peers as being the best of the best will self-report that their capabilities are merely average. This is a big challenge. Here's a little snapshot for how you're feeling about this challenge. We asked you to fill in a little survey before this webinar, and this page takes some of the results from that survey. The top of the page shows the overall rating of the conduciveness or the friendliness of your culture for innovation. The numbers at the top part show the overall group that we sent the survey to. The bottom part are people who are specifically on the webinar here today. And you can see, consistent with everything we've seen, being an environment that is highly friendly, highly conducive to innovation is clearly the exception, not the norm. 57% of you said your environments are either neutral or somewhat unfriendly to innovation. You have some clear strengths on which to build. You believe that your people have the right skills, innovation is treated strategically, and you're good at generating ideas, but some opportunity areas that we see consistently when we're out in the field as well. Short-term pressures crowding out the space for thinking, a lot of talk about innovation without having a common language and common purpose for what we do, and the very best ideas getting bogged down in some of our systems. That third challenge, good ideas getting bogged down in systems, is one of the inspirations for our recent article. Dave, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this notion of the invisible pathways that so often characterize what's required for innovation to succeed in a large organization. What does that mean?
Yes, well, there's a paradox related to some of the things Scott was just saying, which is that every company agrees, for the most part, that innovation is a critical strategic priority. They're also pretty hard on themselves when you ask them to self-assess how good they are at innovation. And yet, if you then ask them, point us to some examples of innovations that have been successful in your company over the years, they usually have no trouble pointing to a pretty significant and impressive list of things that they've done that have been quite innovative. And in fact, for a company to even be successful at all and to reach a certain scale, they have to have innovated by definition. And so there appears to be a paradox there. And the way that we resolve that based on our work with hundreds of companies and studying hundreds more is through this idea of invisible innovation pathways. So when innovation is happening in a company, it must be the case that things are going through what we would say are the generic stages of an innovation process. So ideas are being generated, they're being developed, they're being prioritized, they're being resourced, they're being tested, and then they're being scaled. But all of that can be happening in spite of the company as opposed to part of an explicit, well-defined, well-managed process, and it's really a serendipitous thing that happens. And just as one quick example that we talked about in the article, we worked with one of the biggest insurance companies a few years ago, and when we asked them to point to some of the interesting innovations they developed over the past few years, there was this app, an iPhone app that was actually a pretty cool, impressive thing that essentially was a virtual agent, like an insurance agent, and it kind of replaced the role of the agent in some areas. And we said, well, how did that get developed? Was that something that came out of a roadmap that you prioritized? And in fact, it wasn't. It turned out to have been developed by a young guy who was just out of college. He was an engineer. He had a hobby of creating apps just for fun. He was doing this at his desk one day, and one of the board members or executive committee members happened to be in that area of the company that day, dropped by, asked him what he was working on. He showed it to them. He thought it was pretty impressive, and it ended up getting put into the development pipeline and prioritized and rolled out at a pretty large scale. And it was just entirely serendipitous. If that interaction had not taken place, who knows what would have happened. But it's a great example of what we mean by these invisible innovation pathways. They're the pathways that things take that are not explicitly defined that can have great outcomes, but result in outcomes that are typically less efficient than if you explicitly define how you're going to do it, and also don't give you a way to determine if it's the best use of your resources, the most strategic thing to pursue.
And I think you have some circumstances where it's even worse than all of that. You have situations like the bullet points that should appear on your screen now, where a company spots a need to do something markedly different. The CEO and the board gets behind it. They says this is a strategic opportunity, and they make a big resource allocation decision at a macro level. The challenge, if you don't understand and disentangle these invisible innovation pathways, is what we call the shadow strategy, which is distinct from the actual strategy that you follow, or distinct from the stated strategy you follow, because it is driven by some of the day-to-day decisions that are made inside a company. Again, in many cases, a very invisible sort of process. So when you have a circumstance where the stated strategy and the shadow strategy begin to drift apart, even when you spot a need to make a big change, even when you make an investment, even when the board is very strongly behind it, you can end up with very disappointing results. Here's a painfully sad example of this. You go back about 15 years ago, and Microsoft spots the opportunity to go big in what we now would call contextual advertising or search advertising. They spot it before Google does. Steve Ballmer, then the CEO, pounds the table and says, we have got to succeed with search engine marketing. And of course, when Steve Ballmer pounds the table, people listen to him. This is a charismatic person involved in the early days of Microsoft, wields a lot of power, etc. But what ended up happening? Just like Blockbuster didn't quite get responding to Netflix right, and just like Kodak didn't manage digital imaging exactly right, the shadow strategy came and got Microsoft. Despite the CEO and board backing it, the day-to-day decisions inside the company ended up with Microsoft not making big investments into search engines. You ask why that is the case, and you get into all the micro decisions that people make that tie to their incentives and power structures in organizations and the way decisions are made and the way that resources are allocated. And all of these lead even well-intentioned, even well-run, even well-meaning companies to miss some of the big changes in their marketplace. Clearly, we could talk about this for hours, and I think we all understand these circumstances, and we all have our painful examples of companies that haven't realized their full innovation potential. The question then is, what do you actually go and do about it? There's a couple things that we've seen companies do that don't work. One thing to do is to take what really is a system-level problem, an intricate system-level problem, and try to fight that by doing a thing. That might be running a hackathon, it might be setting up a new growth group, it might be running a contest for employees to submit ideas, or it might be this very real example that IBM parodied in a commercial a few years ago of a company that had their executives dress up in costumes, pronouncing themselves to be Innovation Man, to show how the culture was open to new ideas. We've been part of these things, we all have. They don't work. You cannot fight a system-level problem with a point-level solution. Individually, these things are okay, but if you don't approach the problem systematically, your chances of success are pretty low. One thing you might choose to do is to try and have a DNA transplant. You might hire people from the hot innovation company of the day. This is a picture of Facebook's offices in New York as just one example, and say if we just inject this talent into our system, then we are going to be able to change the face of the company. Well, we know what happens here. Sometimes the organ rejects the host, and the people who come in say, this is not what I want to do, and leave. Even worse, people who were very innovative in one context get into an organization and pretty soon begin to look like and talk like and think like everybody else in the organization. DNA transplants don't work either. The third thing that we've seen people do is to fight systems with systems. We had an article that we co-authored with the then CEO, Chief Technology Officer of Procter & Gamble, Bruce Brown, a couple years ago that described a multi-year comprehensive systematic investment that company made to create what we called a new growth factory. This can be very effective, and in this case it helped P&G dramatically increase its innovation success rate, but this takes a long time. It takes substantial resources, and it isn't something that you can begin to do immediately. So the idea that we posit in our recent article is to do something different. So before we talk to some of the elements of the answer, we'd love to hear from you. Of the 5 things that are on your screen here, developing great ideas, finding time and resources to develop those ideas, getting leadership support, commercializing and scaling ideas, and managing interfaces with the core business, where do you feel the biggest pain? What is the barrier that you face within your business and business unit? The poll question is on the screen now. The polls are open. You've got 5 choices there, and we would love to hear from you. Where is the biggest pain point? All right, we've got more than 80% of you who have voted, which is unusually high compliance rate. So thanks everybody for participating. I think, Kristen, we can open the results and share them with the group. So interestingly here, developing great ideas, which is what we often hear in the field as the problem, it did not come up as the #1 problem here, which we absolutely agree with. Many people will say that our problem is an idea generation problem. That is almost never the case. I think you correctly have noted the real problems in many organizations. And we see here an interesting balance of things between finding the time and resources, securing support, commercializing and scaling ideas, and managing interfaces with, and sometimes transitions to the core business. And I think this helps to indicate the notion of a system-level problem. There isn't one single thing that is behind innovation struggles. Usually it's a bunch of these things coming together. So maybe, Dave, I can turn the mic back over to you, and you can explain to us what this idea of the minimum viable innovation system is.
Sure. So Scott described just this idea that point solutions aren't effective to solve your innovation challenges from a capability perspective, that you really have to think about things from a system perspective. And you know, we a couple of years ago wrote about this concept of a growth factory, which was a fairly elaborate system that covered all of the different elements that need to be in place or that are in place in a very mature well-functioning system. So the question we asked ourselves in this case is, what are really the minimum set of things that you need in place to get started? So you're going to need more than one thing by definition because it's a system, but what's the minimum viable innovation system? And we took that term from the world of lean startups where it connotes a kind of stripped-down functional prototype that's good enough. And what we mean by the minimum viable innovation system are really the essential building blocks that allow a company to start creating a reliable, strategically focused, predictable approach to innovation. And there's 4 components to it, and we'll go through each of these and give some examples in some detail. The first is that you need a clear definition of what types of innovation you need to pursue from a strategic perspective. And we'll talk about that in a second, but before you start innovating, it's important to be very clear about what the strategic intent behind your innovation is. And it's often, it's somewhat surprising, but it's often the case that people are not really clear about that. Once you've made that decision, then it's important to define the fishing holes where you're going to go search for attractive new innovation ideas. And this is what we mean by strategic direction, or something that we call strategic opportunity areas, that then give your teams the direction they need to start searching for attractive opportunities. The third thing you need, and this relates to something I think that we just saw in the poll, is you need resources. You can't be successful in pursuing innovation without having some level of dedicated people spending all of their time on this. It's just not effective to have people doing it on nights and weekends or on a part-time basis. It doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of people, but it has to be a few fully dedicated people. And then finally, you need the right mechanisms in place to oversee and manage what's going to be coming out of your minimum viable innovation system and ensure that it has the proper resourcing and organizational support. And we're going to go into each of these in turn. So I'll start with the first one, which is this idea of having a clear direction. And this is the first component of the minimum viable innovation system. And here it's about defining your innovation buckets. So what do we mean by that? Well, innovation is a word that gets used in many different ways, and it's often a word that's used in a myriad of ways and interpreted in a myriad of ways, and it's very vague. It's important when you're trying to make innovation a strategic capability to be quite precise about what you mean by it. And there's 2 reasons you need to do that. One is because you need to link it clearly to your strategic objectives. And there's at least 2 types of innovation that relate to 2 very different strategic objectives that you might have. One is the innovations that you're going to do that are going to be more incremental within the context of your current businesses, current products, current customers, that are the kinds of things you need to be doing year in and year out just to stay competitive in your existing businesses. And we refer to those as core innovations. The other type of strategic objective that's a universal need for all companies is you need to simultaneously be pursuing new types of growth, new business models that might stretch outside of what you do today and that are going to plant the seed of the growth of tomorrow. And every company that we see that has a really well-developed systematic approach to innovation has been pretty clear about what its innovation types are that it's going to pursue and how those link to their strategic priorities. Sometimes they have 3, 4, 5 different types that they're going to pursue because they have a broader set of strategic objectives. But we believe that you need at least those 2 core types. And this slide that we have up right now is just a useful way to think about, for your own purposes, what are some of the varieties of innovation types that you might choose to define. So we believe that a kind of universal definition of all types of innovation is something new that creates value. So all innovations have in common that they create some sort of value, so there's a practical impact from them, and there's something new about them. And therefore you can distinguish between different types of innovation by describing different levels of newness. So how far outside the core are they versus close to the core, and then what kind of value do they create, and what kind of thing are you innovating? And this is what we have some examples of here in the last row. Are you trying to increase share? Are you trying to solidify relationships through add-on services? Are you trying to expand to new geographies, increasing efficiency? There might be some or all of those that are going to be your strategic priorities that would then inform how you define the types of innovation you're going to pursue. So that's the first part of the minimum viable innovation system.
So let's bring this to life a little bit by sharing one of the examples that we detail in the article. And this is a company in the Philippines that is near and dear to my heart. We've done consulting work with this organization from the office that I'm usually based in out in Singapore, though I'm in the United States today, obviously. This is Manila Water. Manila Water was formed in 1997, a subsidiary of the Ayala Corporation, to try to bring water services to the eastern part of Metro Manila, privatized by the government of the Philippines to try to address a really deep problem in that part of Manila. And here it is. This is the circumstance in 1997. Only about 1 in 4 households had reliable access to clean water. Manila Water, over the course of the next 16 years, did something absolutely remarkable. They took basically the same staff that was in place when the organization was privatized in 1997, historical government bureaucrats, injected a little bit of new talent, and transformed the face of water services in Metro Manila to the point where by 2013 that number had gone from 26% to 99%, a phenomenal success story. However, Jerry Ablasa and the rest of his leadership team had to deal with an almost existential question. What do we do next? You can't mathematically go from 26% to 99% to 390%, yet Ablasa was telling the organization and the investors that backed the company that he still wanted it to grow. In fact, he was telling people that the goal was to double net income over the course of the next few years. One of the things you then have to do is figure out if we're going to achieve that goal, innovation. In the case of Manila Water, they ran through the numbers. They looked at today's business, some of the things that they were currently doing, and what that aspiration was in a few years' time, and identified, as you almost always do when you do the analysis, a gap between what they were currently doing and what they needed to do in order to hit their growth aspirations. That is what innovation needs to solve for. Then, as Dave said, you've got to figure out the specific buckets of innovation and roughly how much of that gap each of those buckets are going to close. In Manila Water's case, there were 3 primary broad innovation buckets. The first was continuing to optimize today's business. Manila Water is and will continue to be a very innovative organization that figures out ways to decrease or change the net turbidity ratio, find ways to spend capital expenditure dollars or pesos more effectively and efficiently, and so on. This would contribute about 20% of the growth gap. The other thing that Manila Water could do is to sustain its business, in particular to take a business model that was proven to work in Metro Manila and expand it to other geographies. Those might be other places in the Philippines. It might be markets like Vietnam or Indonesia that have similar problems. That would be about 50% of Manila Water's growth. The final bucket is to go and create new services and new service models to go beyond the traditional provision of water services and some basic consumer waste treatment to really go into new markets where you might serve businesses and so on. And that would make up the final 30% of closing that growth gap. Being as precise as possible without over-engineering the numbers about what exactly innovation needs to do, how you will do it, what the buckets are, and how much you're going to get from each one is a critical component of building the minimum viable system and something that brought great clarity to Manila Water's effort. As Dave said in the introduction, and where I'll introduce for just a minute before turning it back over to Dave, the next part then is taking the next level of detail under some of those broad innovation buckets, particularly the bucket that you might call new or white space or blue ocean or disruptive or whatever, and really pick a few strategic opportunity areas that will be the sources of some of your new growth. Now, when you're going to do this, there are essentially 2 different sources that you can turn to for inspiration. On the left side of the page, you've got Chairman Mao. On the right side of the page, you've got John F. Kennedy. Now, these aren't people that you might normally think of as sources for inspiration for innovation, so let me explain why they're both here. If you've ever heard somebody say, let's let 100 or let's let thousands of flowers bloom, they are perhaps unintentionally channeling the chairman. In the 1950s, the Communist Party in China briefly opened up to dissenting viewpoints in what became known the Hundreds of Flowers campaign. You can predict what happened. The people who came in and brought the dissenting voices out were very quickly identified and thrown into jail. Mao later went on to boast, "It was great. We enticed the snakes out of their caves." This is not good inspiration for innovation. It's not about letting hundreds or thousands of flowers bloom. Rather, it's about picking a handful of problems worth solving. The picture on the right side of the page is John F. Kennedy in 1961 giving his famous moonshot speech, where he committed to send a man to the moon and, importantly, bring him back by the end of the decade. Clearly, there's an emotive part of this, something that really can get people excited. It can galvanize people to act. But it also was something that was feasible. Kennedy had Johnson study all the underlying technologies to make sure that this is something that actually could happen. So you want to think about what can be your equivalent. What are your corporate moonshots? Now, Dave, we've got a specific way to think through this that we call strategic opportunity areas. Maybe you could take the group through this for just a minute or two.
Yeah, so this is quite a helpful construct that we've developed that we find is very effective in giving the right level of orientation to an organization that's looking to pursue especially new growth types of innovation. Because if you don't have a good way to characterize where you want to point your innovation efforts that's at an actionable level, people are not going to really know where to spend their time, and they'll end up going in all kinds of different directions that may or may not be strategic. So we have this concept of a strategic opportunity area, which we define as an actionable area of growth that is at the intersection of some compelling market need, underlying trends, and the company's strategy. And this notion of actionability is a really critical one for assessing whether you've articulated a strategic opportunity area at the right level. And so just to talk you through this framework, which, and then Scott will illustrate this with a company example, the first thing you want to think about is where in the world is there a problem that needs to be solved, or in our language, a job to be done. So something that is highly frustrating for some group of potential customers, for which there's a lot of value at stake if somebody could solve that problem. That's clearly the first thing you want to think about. Secondly, who struggles to solve this problem today? Who is that group of customers or stakeholders who has that problem? And then you want to at least have the kernel of how you might uniquely solve this problem. Obviously, you don't have to have the answer worked out in detail at this level of the process, but you want to at least have some sense of a piece of the solution or the type of solution and how it might link to some capability that you have or you might acquire. And then lastly, you want to think about why are we uniquely positioned to win if we were to offer this type of solution to this type of customer with this type of problem. And just by way of a illustrative example, you might take, for example, as a problem the space of problems related to obesity, for example, which is a broadly defined problem for which there are many subproblems that could be interesting to look at for innovation. It's certainly one where there's a lot of unmet need, where there's a lot of frustration, a lot of value at stake if you could solve it. Who struggles with this problem today? Obviously, many people do, but you might decide that for the purposes of defining your strategic opportunity area, we're going to look at, say, the baby boomer generation because we think that's a big, interesting population that's struggling with this issue. And then finally, how might we uniquely solve this problem? You might look at the intersection of your own capabilities and trends that are underway in the market and decide, we think that there's room for data analytics or big data-based solutions, and so we're going to frame our initial search for solutions around that type of capability. And you can see that the intersection of those things gives you a complete articulation of a strategic opportunity area. And the key to testing it for actionability is to say, okay, if we were to hand that off to a team on Monday morning, would they have an idea of what they should start doing in order to go look for new growth concepts in that space? Does it give them guidance as to what types of customers should we go talk to? What types of technology trends should we go investigate? How should where should we orient some of our initial ideation activities and search for solutions? And you can see the example I just gave gives you enough guidance that you'd be able to do that.
And as Dave said earlier on, it's the fishing hole. So you haven't found the fish yet, but you've at least defined where you're going to go and search for growth. So we make the case in the article that you can get MVIS set up in 90 days without making big commitments of capital or making a lot of additional hires. So here's the way that Manila Water was able to pretty quickly identify a few problems we're solving, a few different strategic opportunity areas. And I think the process that's followed here is one that you can generalize from and say that we can do the same thing as well. The first thing that Manila Water did was really immerse itself in the marketplace, go out into the areas that it was targeting, and spend time with prospective customers, try to deeply understand them at an empathetic level. Whether it's an end consumer or a business owner, really try to get those jobs that aren't well addressed through current solutions. Also scan externally, look at what other people in related markets are currently doing to try to begin to think about answers to that how question that Dave probed. Diverge. In the case of Manila Water, we came up with more than 50 different strategic opportunity areas, and then make some choices. Try to really on a couple or three that serve as a great starting point for your ability to go create growth through innovation. The critical thing to do at this stage, and something that I think Manila Water did very well, is to make choices. There were some things that Manila Water said, absolutely, we're going to go after this. One of the examples in the article is going after what's known as commercial wastewater. So if you're cooking in a picture like the one that you see on your screen here, you're generating some not very good things through the process. Historically in Metro Manila, that was either buried in a tank or just kind of let out the back door. As regulations getting more intense, companies like Jollibee's and McDonald's and others need to find ways to efficiently and effectively treat that commercial wastewater. And Manila Water has lots of capabilities to help with that. So that looks like an exciting area to go and investigate further. One that they considered but decided not to pursue was advertising. They send out market in the Philippines is relatively small, and they had no capabilities that they thought would give them a leg up over some of the other competitors. So this is a basic process that you can use to come up with your strategic opportunity areas. And remember, make choices to focus on the few rather than fractioning things off around hundreds of flowers. So we promised we were going to try to make this as interactive as possible, so we are going to pause here and try to take some of the questions from the audience. We've got a bunch that have already come in, and my colleague Kathy has handed us some on orange sticky notes that we will read a few of and respond to. So we're going to pick probably 2 or 3 here and then move on to the next 2 components of the MVIS. So here's an interesting one. I have a disruptive idea that could be a new growth platform for my company. I think it should be a separate business unit. My manager wants to keep it in the core where it's not getting prioritized. Any advice? You know, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that organizations face. Your organization, by definition, is set up to perpetuate today's business model, to execute what you're doing with efficiency and effectiveness. By definition, it is not designed to discover tomorrow's business or tomorrow's business model. And if you really do have something that is distinct in many dimensions from what you're currently doing, if there is not some degree of organizational separation, the odds of success are pretty low. So what do you do if you're in this circumstance? I think one thing that you might think about is, can I find a non-obvious senior champion? Maybe it's not my direct line boss. Maybe it's somebody else in the organization that can play that important role of shepherding things, as we'll talk about in the final component of the MVIS. Another thing that you can think about doing is seeing, is it something that's already happening in the external market? Maybe we don't have to be the ones who create it. Maybe there's a company out in the market that we can partner with, make an investment in, ultimately acquire, and use that as the basis to drive growth in new and different directions. Those are a couple ideas that I had. Dave, I wondered if you had other things you would add on here. You've got a disruptive idea, and people are wondering, how do I make the case, or where should I put it?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I mean, one of the things we often talk about when we are going into a company and working with the leadership around this broad challenge of driving growth through innovation, and specifically disruptive innovations or innovations outside the core, is the importance of having across the leadership a common language for talking about innovation. And we already talked about that a little bit in terms of the need to define your specific innovation types and the differing strategic intents associated with them. But then on top of that, part of this common language is having people understand why you need to pursue those different types in very different ways, and the causal mechanisms underlying what Scott just said, which is if you try to force disruptive ideas and pursue them in the same way you pursue core ideas, it's just a recipe for failure. So there is an educational component to getting an organization's leadership to have the right framing for what they're trying to do and what it takes to be successful. So anything you can do to share that framing with them and get them to internalize it can be helpful. Because to Scott's point, you need to separate things for a bunch of different reasons, but not least of which is the fact that pursuing a disruptive idea using the same types of planning, the same types of success metrics, the same types of resourcing mechanisms that you do in the core business, it simply doesn't work, because you need to pursue it in a way that's much more emergent, that's much more like the way a startup would pursue a new idea, very nimble and with the ability to change directions as you learn more about what works and what doesn't work. And having a kind of common framing and common language around all of that across the leadership team is one way to address the barrier that they're having to do that right now.
And I would just add one more thing, Dave. You spurred another thought in my mind, and apologize that we see a couple of you have commented that the audio was breaking up a little bit. I think we have addressed that. Hopefully it will continue to be solid. The one other thing to think about is, what can you do to advance an idea that doesn't require anybody saying yes? So what are the things that you can do that don't require additional resources, that don't require additional budget, where you can begin to generate the data that suggests that what you're working on is a good thing to do? Though I will note, if you are in an environment where ultimately senior leadership doesn't get it and you don't deal with this organizational issue, your chances of success are pretty close to zero. So you've got to figure out how to solve that problem. So a couple other good questions have come in that we'll take, and then in the interest of time, we'll get back to the material. One question here is, why do you say hackathons don't work? So let me clarify what I said a little bit. A hackathon can be very effective as part of an integrated system. A hackathon can be a great way to generate new ideas. It can be a great way to generate energy. But if you're trying to have a hackathon do what Dave defined innovation as, which is something new, creates value, if you don't have mechanisms to pick the ideas after the hackathon, to set it up in the right way, to shepherd those ideas, to resource those ideas, you will never turn them into the creation of value. You'll have a lot of ideas, and you'll actually generate organizational frustration because people who worked on those ideas say, hey, what's going to happen with them afterwards? I'm going to pick one more that, Dave, maybe both you and I can answer, and then dive back to the material. The last question that we had here is, I see the need for it, and I understand the point of language, but how do I get senior leadership to buy off on the idea of doing a minimum viable system? I think the thing that I would say here is to demonstrate, as we hopefully have done through the article, that the ask for this is relatively modest. You're not talking about a big budget. You're not talking about big headcount. In many cases, it's about reallocation as opposed to the creation of new resources. And I think when you pair together, we have an opportunity to do some interesting things with minimal spending. You create at least the conditions where people will say, okay, I'll try that and see what happens. Always ask for as little as possible and demonstrate by doing that what you're talking about will actually work. Dave, I'm sure you've got smarter thoughts than me, so share them with the group.
Yeah, I think another thing to think about is speaking to them in the language of their own jobs to be done, which is to drive growth and performance of the organization, and that's why it's so helpful when you're defining the strategic role of innovation to start with what is our midterm and long-term growth. What are our midterm and long-term growth objectives, and how much growth potential do we think we have in the businesses that we're in today, and what's the gap that we're trying to solve for to reach our growth objectives that's not accounted for in our core businesses. that's a framing of the role of innovation that is very much framed through the lens of how the senior leaders think of the world, because they're accountable for that midterm and longer term financial performance. And if you're not going to do a minimum viable innovation system or some sort of systematic approach to it, my question for them would be, well, then what are you going to do to fill that gap? And I would have that conversation with leadership, and it usually frames it in a way that people are willing to admit that they've got a ways to go to reach their growth goals, and they have to find a way to develop new sources of growth outside the core.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you, everyone, for all the great questions. We have many more here. We'll hopefully spend a couple minutes more near the end answering a couple of them. And then, again, we'll try to summarize some of the best when we follow up with you after the webinar. Let's turn to the third and fourth components of the minimum viable innovation system. The third one, which I'll run through, is forming a small, dedicated team. Some of the great stories in the innovation literature, the creation of Post-it notes by 3M, the creation of Gmail by Google, actually do a lot of harm for innovation inside most organizations. In both cases, these were programs that were launched by people who were working in part-time allocations. 3M has the 15% rule. Google has, for much of its history, had the 20% rule, where engineers can dabble and think of different ideas. So a lot of people think that we don't need to dedicate resources. We can just have Wacky Idea Wednesday and Free Thinking Friday, and if you're at a really hard-working company, Special Purpose Saturday, and that will be enough to solve the problem. Yes, if you're in a culture with supporting elements and systems like 3M or Google, perhaps. But most organizations aren't like that. The innovation world is fraught with failure. Most startup companies fail. This is with people waking up every morning, going to sleep every night, obsessing about their business. If you're trying to fight against all those competitors with a bunch of part-timers, your chances of success are very close to zero. The metaphor that I like to use for this has its downsides, so I apologize in advance, but it's got some upsides as well. Think about the two different animals that played a part in making the breakfast on your screen. The chicken participated, the pig is committed. If you are to succeed with innovation, your MVIS needs some innovation pigs, hopefully ones that don't die during the process, but ones that get up every morning and go to sleep every night obsessing about their new growth idea. If you have a bunch of innovation chickens, your odds of success are very low. The questions that we get at this point usually are, this sounds great, but we don't have capacity, or our people don't have the right skills, and you promised me we could do this without a bunch of additional headcount. Let's take each of these in turn very quickly. On the left side of the page, we don't have spare capacity for innovation. I am willing to bet you have capacity for innovation. It's been sucked up in many organizations by what we call zombie projects, the walking undead, that if you are honest about them, will not materially close the growth gap. But still, they shuffle and linger along, taking away the capacity to really succeed and do new things. What do you do in the face of zombie projects? The best advice on this topic, we believe, comes from Rita McGrath, a certified zombie killer who also is a professor at Columbia University. She suggests 5 things. First, predetermine the evaluation criteria you'll use to put the zombies down. Make it as unemotional as possible. Involve outsiders that were not involved in the conception of the idea. I will tell you, through my eyes, my 3 children are the most beautiful children in the world. You need somebody who wasn't there at that moment of conception to say, you know what, the baby's actually pretty ugly, to other children, not mine, of course. Anytime you innovate, McGrath will say 2 good things can happen. Either you can succeed commercially, or you can learn something that sets you up for future success. Capture and codify that learning. Celebrate the success that's happened. Communicate it as widely as possible to let people know that this is a good thing, not a bad thing in your organization. And I said 5, a special bonus 6th point, and perhaps my favorite, provide closure with the symbolic event. McGrath suggests having a wake, a memorial, or a party to let people know that you are done. It's time to move on to the next idea. The Finnish gaming company Supercell, I think, does a great job of this. When they have a new game that is successfully launched, like Clash of Clans, their flagship game, all the developers get a beer. When they shut a game down, all the developers get champagne. showing the organization, number one, we're done. Number two, we're willing to try things even if they don't work out. Let's talk about the second problem. This sounds great. We maybe have put down some zombies and we've got people, but our people don't work at Facebook. They don't work at Google. They don't work at 3M. They don't know how to successfully innovate. Good news. There is a vast literature of books out there that describe what it takes to successfully innovate. Some of our favorite books, a few of which, Truth in Advertising, we have written, appear on the page here. As you start reading through these books, you see common elements behind successful innovation. I'm not going to go through all 11 points on the checklist. They're in the article. You can read them at more depth if you're interested. But what I want to do instead is pick out the two key things that connect many of these elements and give a quick case study of how novice innovators were able to do something that I think is pretty cool. If you strip through the 11 things on the checklist, there really are two things that good innovators always do. The first is they remember the guidance from the great Peter Drucker, who reminds us that the purpose of a business is to create a customer. The most important thing an innovator has to do is pick a problem worth solving. Pick an itch that's not scratched. Pick a job that is not yet done. The next piece of guidance comes from a very different individual, the great American philosopher, actor, and occasional boxer Mike Tyson, who once said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." Great innovators recognize that there is no such thing as a perfect plan. Every idea is partially right and partially wrong. You follow the guidance from these two, the elements on the checklist and so on, and we sincerely believe that anybody can innovate. This is one of the stories detailed in the article from Settlement Music School, a not-for-profit organization in the Philadelphia area that runs music classes, historically primarily for children. Helen Eden took over as executive director a few years ago and decided to make innovation a backbone of the organization. She formed a small group to go out and identify and then create new growth opportunities. Consistent with the guidance from Drucker, they found problems worth solving. They decided to target not children but adults. They heard recurring themes from adults. I want to recapture my youth. I want to make new friends, and so on. They then came up with a bunch of ideas and started to test them. One idea that emerged from the process is pictured at the bottom of your screen, called Adult Rock Band. The idea here is you get a group of people who have not met, perhaps together, under the tutelage of an expert instructor. They can meet up, they can recapture the glory of putting on their old guitar, and ultimately begin to perform like a band. This was done by people who had never done anything that you would consider new product or new service innovation before. They read the literature, they got a little bit of training from some of my colleagues at Innosight, and that was enough to start them down a journey that led to some pretty cool ideas. The final component of the minimum viable system is creating a mechanism to shepherd projects. The basic challenge you have in most organizations is there is a set of disciplines that runs your company. You have annual budgeting processes. There are numerically based activities. If anyone deviates, they get punished pretty severely. All the work takes place internally and so on. It is actually quite a robust set of disciplines if you're trying to optimize today's business model. What you need to put in place if you are to create and discover tomorrow's business model is a distinctly different set of disciplines borrowed from venture capitalists, who in our minds are the best at managing strategic uncertainty in systematic ways. Venture capitalists stage investment. They don't tie it to a calendar. They tie it to when risk is taken off the table. A venture capitalist will tell you the best investments they made were often the most polarizing. They're willing to trust individual partners who believe in an idea. Yes, they look at numbers, but they look beyond that to the story and the team. They know that there's going to be deviations and twists and turns in the path to success, and they go out and feel and touch the raw data to really make sure that they make good decisions about ideas. The leadership literature will talk a lot about how leaders need to be ambidextrous, use both their left and right brains. But the truth is, what you need are leaders who are chameleons, who can morph between the blue space on the left where they're optimizing and the green space on the right when they're beginning to think of trying different things. The minimum viable innovation system needs a handful of senior leaders who can be chameleons, who can think and act differently as they try to shepherd the new and different ideas through the strategic uncertainty that characterizes any innovative idea. This will cause them to change the way they make key decisions in an organization. Here's one simple thing that you've got to think differently about if you're overseeing innovation. What marks a successful innovator? By metaphor, consider the 3 different games here. How do you identify whether someone is good at roulette? If you can't think of an answer, it's good. It's a trick question. There is no such thing as a good roulette player. It's a game of pure chance. If people are playing these games inside your organization, punish them. They're taking stupid risks. What marks a good chess player? Chess is a game of pure skill. All you have to do to identify a good chess player is look at the outcomes they are achieving. This is what it's like when you're optimizing today's business. You're playing a game of chess. You look at the results people achieve. Innovation, like blackjack, like hitting a baseball, like investing in a stock, is somewhere in between these two. Any single time you do it, success mixes a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill. In games like this, you look not at the results that are achieved a single time it's played. It is the process people are following, the learning they're getting as they're going through the journey. The senior leaders that need to shepherd some of the new ideas in a minimum viable innovation system have to think differently about how they interact with teams they're overseeing and what metrics they're using to measure progress. Scott Cook, I think, is a great example of this. We won't talk about this for too long because I think a lot of people know Scott and his work at Intuit, but I think he describes it appropriately when he talks about how the job of a leader is different today. It's not about making decisions. It's about putting in place systems to try to encourage experiments in new ways. Dave, I wondered if you could bring this idea of having the right group of senior leaders shepherd innovation ideas in the right way to life a little bit by describing this case study, cool case study of the Hospital for Sick Children. Then we'll provide just 1 or 2 summary thoughts and maybe take a final question or 2 and call it a webinar. Dave.
Great. Yeah, so this is an organization that we had the privilege to work with a few years ago, back in 2010, 2011, when Mary Jo Haddad, who was the CEO at the time, was kicking off an effort to make innovation a key strategic priority for the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children, which is colloquially known as Sick Kids. And she had a belief that there was just a lot of latent innovation potential that could be unlocked if they could just give a little bit of structure to it. She had a sense that there were these invisible innovation pathways manifesting themselves, and if they could just do a few simple things, relatively simple, easy to do things, that they could really unlock a lot of that potential. And they established as a shepherding mechanism this thing that they called the Innovation Working Group. And it was essentially 18 people, a cross-functional team from across the organization, a cross-functional group of leaders. They gave them $250,000 in funding that they had the power to decide where that was going to go. And they really had 2 roles. One was to shepherd ideas and to catalyze the generation and advancement of ideas through the system all the way to implementation, and also to be a mechanism to drive cultural change and generate excitement and change the mindset of people around innovation. And so they set them up with this modest budget and a variety of roles, one of which was to identify ideas that would be submitted by employees, and then for the ones that were most promising, they would give them some funding and then find a way to get the person submitting it freed up from their day job for a period of time so they could work on and test the idea. They also regarded themselves as a kind of barrier removal force. So when people would encounter barriers to the innovations they were trying to pursue, they would try to step in and find ways to remove those barriers. And they ran a number of different activities to both generate more ideas, advance more ideas, but also to spread language and excitement about innovation, including company-wide ideation sessions that would involve staff, patients, families, the public as participants to generate a wide variety of ideas. And they would hold annual innovation expos that they would use as a vehicle to celebrate innovations that had been developed, regardless of whether they succeeded or failed. So they consciously, to the example of the software developers, they would celebrate not only innovation successes, but also ideas that were good ideas, but for one reason or another didn't work out.
So there it is. That's the minimum viable innovation system. We're giving you some examples, some things in our article, some things that go beyond it. But just to sum up, I'm going to recap the key parts of the argument. Dave will describe a little bit about how to go beyond the MVIS, and we'll call it a webinar. If you want to successfully drive the new and different inside your organization, you want to remember the 4 things we talked about. Define it clearly, direct it strategically, moonshots, not hundreds of flowers. Resource it intensively, put the zombies down to free up capacity, and nurture it carefully so that you can make those invisible pathways visible and consciously manage and improve them. Remember, this is a system. This is not you get to pick and choose. You need to do all of this or do none of it. If there is one thing that requires more of your attention, it's the resource allocation process. It is making sure that you've got people and dollars or whatever currency behind ideas. As you heard in many of these examples, it's not just about how you're going to reward success. In many cases, the more important thing is how you're going to treat failure. Organizations will often describe or moan how risk-averse they are, and if you severely punish failure, no surprise that that will be the outcome. Finally, this will not work without active, concerted leadership from at least someone on the senior executive team, particularly when you're managing the complexity of interfacing with and transitioning to the core business. It doesn't require everyone, it doesn't require an army, it doesn't require huge budgets, but it does require somebody picking up the mantle and really driving forward against it. So, Dave, our last piece of content here, you want to provide some advice to people, I'm going to skip through this, about how you go beyond the minimum viable system. What could they do beyond it?
Right. So in each of these 4 areas that we described as components of the minimum viable system, there are certainly many different ways you can take it to the next level. In the first case, in the first component on defining your innovation buckets, you can certainly go further in the direction of being more precise about how much you need to grow and what the different sources of growth are going to be. And then companies that get really sophisticated about this will even put in place a multi-year, what we call a master plan that is organized around those different sources of growth that details how much growth they're going to expect each year from each type and what the requisite level of investment is going to be in order to achieve that growth. And then it links very nicely to their annual resource allocation process. And they can also get more specific around their strategic opportunity areas by setting boundaries around where they're not going to go. There's a number of capabilities you can think about standing up to make the processes more robust. Some of the key ones that we think about are capabilities to keep your fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the industry around you, thinking broadly about the different sources of ideas for new growth, and Scott mentioned some of those, whether it's scanning the horizon and keeping your fingers on the pulse of how customer needs are evolving, or looking at the startup community, trying to monitor what innovation is happening there. And you can certainly define more robust processes than what we've described here in the article, and there are some good references, I think, in the article for places to go to get more information. And then finally, there are a variety of things you can do to get more sophisticated about tracking your overall growth portfolio and governing your growth portfolio. And again, there are some good references in the article you can follow up on to get some more information on those.
Outstanding. Well, we are exactly at 2 o'clock on our chart. We've got a couple other fun and exciting slides that we're not going to go through here. We wanted to first thank everybody for taking an hour out of their day to spend it with me and my colleague Dave. We really enjoy talking about the subject, as you can probably imagine. If you have further questions that we didn't answer, please feel free to contact either one of us. You've got our email address and my Twitter feed on the screen here. We are going to keep the line open. There are some great questions that came in, and we'll answer them for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. Certainly understand that a number of you have other commitments and need to go, so wanted to first say thank you, and we will pause for just 20 seconds or so, and then we'll dive into some of the questions. So if you've got more, keep them coming, and we'll answer some of them either live here, or we'll answer some of them via email later on. Thanks, everyone. All right, while we transition in just a few minutes of questioning, there's one important one that just came in. While we still have Looks like 80% of you on the line now. Where can we find the article you wrote? I believe you can find that on our website, www.innosight.com. Right on the middle of the homepage, if you click on the picture that's got some nice balloons going through the air, you'll be able to get to that includes a download of the article. It's also on www.hbr.org. It's in the Harvard Business Review. Use the good tool Google, build an innovation engine in 90 days, and you will find a copy of the article. Okay, Dave, here's a question that came in. The best metrics to track progress. Now, I don't know, Kathy, was this progress of ideas or progress of the whole thing?
The whole thing.
The whole thing. The best metrics to track progress of the whole thing. So how do you know that you're making progress against closing the growth gap? I'll start by saying a thing or two, and then Dave will add on. This is a complicated topic. I think at the most basic level, you can say, look, we've got a growth gap. We should be able to estimate the risk-adjusted value of the pipeline of initiatives we're working on and make some basic assumptions to say, essentially, are we at sufficiency? Do we have enough things that we're working on that give us confidence that we're going to close that gap? That's one thing that we've seen some people do. Another thing that you can do to track progress is look at some input-related things. How many ideas are we working on? How many strategic opportunity areas did we consider? How many things did we discard, et cetera? I think a third thing that you can think about as well is more down at the level of an individual idea. How well are we doing at removing the key uncertainties behind an idea? The art of successful innovation comes down to disciplined experimentation, picking out the key risks and uncertainties behind an idea and being ruthless and rigorous at running experiments to increase your knowledge about those unknowns. So at a micro level, you can try to understand, are we learning the things we need to learn to give us confidence to make decisions about ideas, remembering that sometimes the decision will be, we're going to stop working on this so we've got more capacity for other things. So those are at least a few of the things that I've seen. Dave, I wonder if you've got some other ideas as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I mean, obviously the metrics that people are going to get most excited about are the ones that link your innovation projects and your innovation efforts to attributable dollars coming in that would not have otherwise. And Scott mentioned those, but especially in the early days, you know, you may be a year or two or several years off from realizing the financial impact, especially for more disruptive ideas. And in those early stages, some of the things Scott is talking about around the robustness of your idea pipeline and advancing to certain stage learning milestones as you're moving these ideas through the pipeline are helpful. And then one other category is milestones related to implementing the system itself. So as you're standing up these different components of the system in the first 90 days and then in the months beyond that, you can set yourself implementation milestones associated with that become metrics to track progress against.
Outstanding. So the next question that came in, or that we've chosen to answer, other questions came in, but the next question that we're going to discuss is related to the human side of this. What are the criteria I might use to select the type of participants who thrive in this type of environment? I'll start with two thoughts here and then turn it back over to Dave. The first thing that I would say is we have a belief, and we have seen demonstrated proof, that the ability to do something new that creates value is something that exists in a wider population than many perceive. I think many perceive that you need to have a special gift, a special touch. You've got to be Steve Jobs or Richard Branson or Tony Fernandez or whomever. But that's not true. There is a discipline and rigor behind innovation that many more people can do than people realize. The second thing I would say is, despite what I just said, if you are to look for a characteristic that helps when you're dealing with new ideas, the single word that I would look for is curiosity. You have people who will do crossword puzzles, not because they're getting intrinsic value out of it, just because they like to solve puzzles. And you have that innate curiosity. I think it helps you take those punches from Tyson, because the truth of innovation is there are going to be fits and false starts and left turns and moves in different directions and so on. And if you don't have that curiosity and that desire to learn, sometimes it can be really frustrating. There's other things in different research literature as well, but that's the thing I really like to see in people who work on these sorts of things. Dave, what else would you add?
Well, the one thing I would add to that is that there's been some interesting work done by some some colleagues and some folks outside of our firm on what's called the Innovator's DNA, where they've, and there's a book of that title and an article that's been written on that topic, where they characterize the behaviors of people that are particularly creative or innovative. And just to link that to what Scott was saying about curiosity, I think all of those behaviors in some way are manifestations of curiosity. So behaviors, for example, of trying to really deeply understand potential customers or people and just the problems that they're struggling with. Behaviors around networking broadly outside of your own, habitual social circles. Behaviors related to exploring ideas in diverse areas that might look quite different than what you're typically exposed to in the day-to-day. Those are all behaviors that contribute to one's ability to be creative and innovative, and are all ones that I think the more naturally curious you are, the more you're likely to engage in those behaviors. But to Scott's point also about it being a learnable discipline, you can decide to do those things as well and drive additional creativity and innovative thinking that way.
Excellent. Well, we've got one other question that's been given to us on an orange sticky note, so we'll call this the last question of the extended webinar. It looks like we still got a good portion of people here, so I appreciate those who have stayed with us a little bit longer. How can large organizations grow the skills to go through this process? Are they using internal social networks to drive learning, for example? I'll start with a couple of thoughts about this, and then again turn it over to Dave to build on those thoughts. So the first thing that I would say is one of the reasons why we are such advocates of this minimum viable innovation system is it makes it very easy for large organizations to get started. Often it can appear daunting because you say, we're not, pick the company, Pixar or IBM or P&G or 3M or whatever, and therefore it's just too hard for us. And by having something that's a simple starting point, you generate proof points that build confidence that taking the next steps and building further infrastructure makes sense. So making the problem smaller, I think, is a great way to learn skills. I think the notion of using internal social networks is a great point. I think one of the things we've seen organizations do is find some way to create what many would call a community of practice, to find the like-minded people inside an organization that might have developed competencies among key elements for innovation. So there might be, in some companies, a group of people who have done empathetic market research or ethnographic market research, who've got first-hand experience who can help people who haven't done it before. There might be other people who have designed and executed quick tests. There might be other people who have the special glasses that allow them to see the innovation, the invisible innovation pathways that can tell you make a left turn here and not a right turn here. Finding ways to create connections between the people who have successfully innovated in your company certainly helps. As Dave said in the beginning, every company innovates. You cannot exist today if you don't innovate. You've done it before, and finding ways to connect those who have succeeded, unfortunately sometimes in spite of the company, can be a good building block for future success.
And some companies, many companies, go so far as to establish an internal training function or an internal group of experts that have the specialized knowledge and skills that they can offer training or coaching to groups within the organization, either in actual training programs or what we call action learning programs, where people in the organization, teams that are working on real projects, can reach out to these coaches or trainers and get in the field training on applied training in the context of the projects they're working on. And so you get kind of two benefits for the price of one. You get your idea advanced, and then the people working on it get some real coaching and learning on how to do it better.
Outstanding. So with that, we will close today's webinar. Thanks